In the bustling corridors of corporate America, Marcus Chen had learned to walk with measured steps. Not the hurried gait of anxiety that once characterized his movement through these same halls 5 years ago, but the deliberate pace of someone who had discovered something most of his colleagues never would: the profound power of emotional detachment. His transformation hadn't been sudden or dramatic, it had been a quiet revolution, one that began with a single devastating moment of clarity. The moment arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, when Marcus found himself sitting across from his then supervisor, Janet Williams, in her sterile conference room. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she delivered the words that would reshape his entire approach to life. "Marcus, I'm afraid we're going to have to let you go. The quarterly numbers just aren't there, and we need to make some tough decisions." The words hit him like physical blows, each syllable carrying the weight of his apparent failure, his inadequacy, his worthlessness in the eyes of the organization he had poured his soul into for 3 years. But it wasn't the termination itself that proved transformative, it was what happened next. As Janet continued speaking about severance packages and transition periods, Marcus felt something break inside him. Not his spirit, as one might expect, but something far more significant: the fragile construction of his emotional dependencies, his need for external validation, his attachment to outcomes beyond his control. In that moment, as he watched Janet's mouth move and heard her words as if from a great distance, Marcus experienced what he would later recognize as the first stirring of true emotional detachment. The man who sat in that conference room was weak, dependent on others' approval, crushed by circumstances beyond his control, emotionally reactive to every slight and setback. But the man who would walk out of that building 30 minutes later had begun the process of destroying that weakness entirely. This destruction would not be violent or dramatic, it would be methodical, strategic, and, ultimately, liberating. The architecture of weakness. Before understanding the power of emotional detachment, one must first recognize the intricate architecture of human weakness. Marcus had spent 32 years of his life constructing this architecture without realizing it, building elaborate emotional dependencies that left him vulnerable to every storm that life chose to send his way. His sense of self-worth was inextricably linked to his job performance, his relationships were colored by his desperate need for approval, and his decision-making process was compromised by fear of failure and rejection. The weakness that most people carry through life is not a single flaw but a complex system of emotional vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities manifest in predictable patterns: the need to be liked, the fear of confrontation, the attachment to specific outcomes, the tendency to take things personally, and the compulsive need to react emotionally to every stimulus. Each of these patterns creates a point of leverage that others can use to manipulate, control, or simply predict one's behavior. Marcus began to see these patterns everywhere once he started looking. In the office buildings where he now worked as a consultant, he observed grown men and women reduced to children by their supervisors' disapproval, brilliant minds paralyzed by the fear of making mistakes, and talented individuals sabotaging their own success rather than risk the vulnerability that comes with trying something new. The weakness wasn't in their skills or intelligence, it was in their emotional architecture. The realization that struck Marcus most profoundly was how this emotional architecture created a kind of slavery. When your happiness depends on others' approval, you become enslaved to their opinions. When your self-worth is tied to external achievements, you become enslaved to circumstances beyond your control. When you react emotionally to every provocation, you become enslaved to the moods and manipulations of those around you. The weak self that most people carry through life is not weak because it lacks ability, it is weak because it has surrendered its sovereignty to external forces. But Marcus discovered something that changed everything: this architecture of weakness is not permanent. It is constructed, which means it can be deconstructed. The man who destroys his weak self systematically and completely creates something that cannot be destroyed by others because there are no longer any emotional leverage points for them to exploit. The methodology of destruction, the process of destroying one's weak self, is not about suppressing emotions or becoming coldly indifferent to the world. It is about strategic emotional detachment, the conscious decision to separate one's inner state from external circumstances and other people's actions. This detachment is not numbness, it is clarity. It is not indifference, it is sovereignty. Marcus began this process by conducting what he called an emotional audit of his life. He systematically identified every area where his emotional state was dependent on something outside his control. The list was longer than he had expected. His mood was affected by traffic, weather, coworkers' attitudes, his supervisor's feedback, the stock market, news headlines, social media interactions, and countless other variables that he had no power to influence. Each item on this list represented a point of weakness, a place where external forces could manipulate his internal state. The methodology he developed was deceptively simple but required tremendous consistency and self-awareness. For each emotional dependency he identified, Marcus created what he called a detachment protocol. The protocol had three components: recognition, redirection, and reinforcement. Recognition involved training himself to notice when his emotional state was being influenced by external factors. This required developing an almost scientific observation of his own reactions. When he found himself becoming angry at a rude driver, anxious about a project deadline, or discouraged by a rejection, he would pause and identify the external trigger. The simple act of recognition began to create space between the stimulus and his response. Redirection involved consciously choosing a different response to the recognized trigger. Instead of allowing his mood to be determined by the rude driver, Marcus would remind himself that the driver's behavior had nothing to do with him and everything to do with that person's own internal state. Instead of becoming anxious about a deadline, he would focus on what actions he could take in the present moment. The key was redirecting his attention from things he couldn't control to things he could. Reinforcement involved strengthening these new response patterns through repetition and reflection. Marcus kept a daily journal where he recorded instances of successful emotional detachment, analyzed situations where he had fallen back into old patterns, and planned strategies for similar situations in the future. Over time, these new responses became automatic. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Marcus found that he could sit in meetings where others became defensive or reactive and maintain perfect composure. He could receive criticism without taking it personally, face rejection without losing confidence, and encounter hostility without becoming hostile in return. More importantly, he began to see how this emotional detachment gave him enormous strategic advantages in every area of his life. The strategic application emotional detachment is not an end in itself, it is a tool that creates unprecedented strategic opportunities. When Marcus learned to detach from outcomes, he paradoxically began achieving better results because his decisions were no longer clouded by fear or desperation. When he stopped needing others' approval, he began commanding more respect because people sensed his self-sufficiency. When he ceased reacting emotionally to provocations, he gained the ability to respond strategically instead of reactively. In his consulting work, Marcus discovered that clients trusted him more than his competitors precisely because he didn't seem emotionally invested in winning their business. His detachment signaled confidence and competence in a way that eager salesmanship never could. He could present solutions objectively, walk away from bad deals without desperation, and maintain his standards because his self-worth wasn't dependent on any particular outcome. The strategic applications of emotional detachment extended far beyond professional contexts. In relationships, Marcus found that his ability to remain centered regardless of others' emotional states made him a more attractive friend, partner, and colleague. People were drawn to his stability, his non-reactive presence, and his ability to provide perspective during their emotional storms. Paradoxically, by becoming less emotionally dependent on others, he became more valuable to them. One of the most powerful strategic applications Marcus discovered was in negotiation. When you are genuinely detached from outcomes, when your emotional state is not dependent on getting what you want, you hold tremendous power in any negotiation. You can make offers without desperation, receive rejections without discouragement, and walk away from unfavorable deals without regret. This detachment often leads to better results because the other party senses that they cannot manipulate you through emotional leverage. But, perhaps the most significant strategic advantage of emotional detachment is the clarity it provides for decision-making. When emotions are not clouding your judgment, you can see situations as they truly are rather than as you fear they might be or hope they will be. Marcus found that he could assess opportunities and risks more accurately, choose courses of action based on logic rather than emotion, and adapt to changing circumstances without the emotional turmoil that usually accompanies uncertainty. The weak self that most people carry through life is constantly making decisions based on fear, hope, anger, or the need for approval. These emotional influences lead to poor choices, missed opportunities, and outcomes that serve the emotion rather than the person's actual interests. The individual who has destroyed these emotional dependencies can make decisions based purely on their strategic value, leading to consistently better results over time. The paradox of power through indifference. As Marcus's transformation deepened, he encountered one of the most counterintuitive principles of emotional detachment: the more indifferent you become to getting something, the more likely you are to get it. This principle applies to virtually every area of human endeavor, from career advancement to romantic relationships to creative pursuits. The principle works because desperation and attachment create energy patterns that others can sense and that influence outcomes in subtle but profound ways. When you desperately want a job, the interviewer can sense your desperation and interprets it as a sign of weakness or inadequacy. When you are attached to a particular romantic outcome, potential partners sense your neediness and find it unattractive. When you are emotionally invested in a creative project's success, that investment can actually compromise the quality of the work because you become afraid to take risks or make bold choices. Marcus tested this principle systematically across different areas of his life. When he approached job interviews with genuine indifference to the outcome, prepared to walk away if the opportunity wasn't right for him, he consistently received better offers. When he entered social situations without needing to impress anyone or gain approval, he found himself naturally becoming the center of attention. When he worked on projects without attachment to how they would be received, the quality of his work improved dramatically. This paradox extends to the realm of influence and leadership. The leader who desperately wants to be followed appears weak and inspires little confidence. The individual who genuinely doesn't need to lead often finds others naturally drawn to their direction. Marcus observed this pattern in corporate environments repeatedly. The executives who seemed most desperate for power were often the least effective, while those who appeared genuinely indifferent to climbing the ladder often rose quickly through the ranks. The paradox is not magic, it has clear psychological and social mechanisms. When you are detached from outcomes, you make decisions based on principles rather than expedience, you take intelligent risks because failure doesn't threaten your identity, and you communicate with authentic confidence rather than desperate hope. Others sense these qualities and respond positively to them, often giving you exactly what you're not desperately seeking. But the most profound aspect of this paradox is how it relates to personal fulfillment. Marcus discovered that by caring less about achieving specific outcomes, he became more satisfied with whatever outcomes actually materialized. By destroying his attachment to particular definitions of success, he found success in forms he had never imagined. By becoming indifferent to others' opinions of his happiness, he became genuinely happy. The destruction of fear. Fear is perhaps the most pervasive weakness that limits human potential, and Marcus found that emotional detachment was the most effective antidote to fear he had ever encountered. Not because detachment eliminates fear entirely, that would be neither possible nor desirable, but because it changes one's relationship to fear in fundamental ways. Before his transformation, Marcus's life was largely governed by various forms of fear: fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of judgment, fear of loss, fear of conflict, and fear of the unknown. These fears influenced his decisions, limited his opportunities, and kept him trapped in patterns that served his security rather than his growth. He chose safe jobs over interesting ones, avoided difficult conversations, and declined opportunities that carried any significant risk of failure or embarrassment. The process of emotional detachment gradually revealed that most fears are not about the feared event itself but about one's attachment to a particular outcome or self-image. Marcus wasn't really afraid of losing his job, he was afraid of what that loss would mean about his worth as a person. He wasn't afraid of being rejected, he was afraid of what rejection would say about his attractiveness or value. He wasn't afraid of failure, he was afraid of what failure would do to his carefully constructed identity as a competent person. When he began systematically destroying these attachments, the fears began to lose their power. If your self-worth is not dependent on your job, then losing your job becomes simply a practical problem to solve rather than an identity crisis to endure. If your sense of attractiveness is not dependent on any particular person's approval, then rejection becomes merely information rather than devastation. If your identity is not tied to never failing, then failure becomes a learning opportunity rather than a catastrophe. This transformation in his relationship to fear opened up possibilities that Marcus had never imagined. He could start a consulting business because he wasn't afraid of failure. If it failed, he would simply try something else. He could end relationships that weren't serving him because he wasn't afraid of being alone. Solitude had become a source of strength rather than something to be avoided. He could speak truth to power because he wasn't afraid of the consequences. His sense of integrity was more important than any external approval or punishment. The destruction of fear-based decision-making led to what Marcus came to think of as freedom of action. When you are not constrained by fear of outcomes, you can choose actions based purely on their alignment with your values and objectives. This freedom created a kind of personal power that Marcus had never experienced before, the power to act according to his own judgment regardless of external pressures or potential consequences. But, perhaps most importantly, the destruction of fear revealed that most of what we spend our lives afraid of either never happens or, when it does happen, proves far less devastating than we imagined. Marcus lost jobs, faced rejection, encountered criticism, and experienced various forms of failure, but his emotional detachment meant that these experiences could not destroy him. Each experience that he survived without being destroyed by it further weakened the power of fear over his future decisions. The social dimension of detachment. One of the most challenging aspects of emotional detachment is navigating its social implications. As Marcus's transformation deepened, he found that his relationships with others began to change in unexpected ways. Some people were drawn to his new stability and confidence, while others were threatened by his lack of dependency on their approval or manipulation. The social dimension of emotional detachment operates on multiple levels. On the surface level, detached individuals often appear more confident, composed, and reliable than their emotionally reactive counterparts. They don't create drama, they don't require constant reassurance, and they don't impose their emotional states on others. These qualities make them attractive friends, colleagues, and partners to emotionally healthy people. However, emotional detachment can be threatening to individuals whose own sense of power or security depends on their ability to control or manipulate others through emotional leverage. Marcus discovered that some of his former friends and colleagues became uncomfortable with his transformation because they could no longer predict or influence his behavior through the emotional buttons that had worked in the past. People who had built relationships based on creating drama, providing rescue, or receiving validation found that these patterns no longer worked with him. This social sorting process, while sometimes painful, ultimately improved the quality of Marcus's relationships. The people who remained in his life after his transformation were those who appreciated his authenticity, respected his boundaries, and could engage with him on a foundation of mutual respect rather than emotional manipulation or codependency. These relationships were deeper, more honest, and more fulfilling than the emotion-based connections he had maintained previously. Marcus also discovered that emotional detachment gave him unique value in social situations. He could provide perspective during others' emotional crises precisely because he wasn't caught up in the emotional intensity himself. He could offer honest feedback because he wasn't afraid of damaging his relationships through truth-telling. He could serve as a stable presence in unstable situations because his inner state wasn't dependent on external circumstances. The social implications extended to professional contexts as well. Marcus found that colleagues and clients began treating him differently as his emotional detachment became apparent. They sought his opinion on difficult decisions, trusted him with sensitive information, and included him in important conversations because they knew he wouldn't react emotionally or use information against them. His reputation for objectivity and reliability opened doors that had been closed when he was more emotionally reactive. But, perhaps the most significant social benefit of emotional detachment was the freedom it provided from social pressures and expectations. Marcus no longer felt compelled to conform to others' expectations, participate in activities that didn't interest him, or maintain relationships that weren't mutually beneficial. This freedom allowed him to be more authentically himself in all social contexts, which paradoxically made him more attractive to others and more effective in achieving his social objectives. The professional transformation. The workplace became a laboratory where Marcus could observe the practical applications of emotional detachment in action. The corporate environment, with its complex hierarchies, competing interests, and high-stakes decision-making, provided countless opportunities to test and refine his approach to professional interactions. Before his transformation, Marcus had been what management consultants might call a high-maintenance employee. His mood was visible to everyone around him, his performance fluctuated based on external feedback, and his decision-making was compromised by fear of making mistakes or disappointing his supervisors. He took criticism personally, celebrated victories too enthusiastically, and allowed office politics to drain his energy and focus. The emotionally detached Marcus who emerged from his systematic self-reconstruction was an entirely different professional entity. He could receive harsh criticism and extract only the useful information while remaining completely unaffected by the emotional undertones. He could watch colleagues engage in political maneuvering without feeling compelled to participate or react. He could focus on his work regardless of the office atmosphere, interpersonal dramas, or organizational uncertainties. This transformation had immediate practical benefits. Marcus's productivity increased because he wasn't spending mental energy on emotional reactions to workplace situations. His decision-making improved because he could evaluate options objectively without fear of failure or need for approval clouding his judgment. His relationships with colleagues became more professional and effective because they weren't complicated by his emotional needs or reactions. But the deeper professional transformation was in how Marcus approached career development and opportunity. When he stopped being emotionally attached to specific outcomes, he became more strategic in his choices and more effective in his execution. He could negotiate salary and responsibilities from a position of genuine strength because he was prepared to walk away from any opportunity that didn't meet his standards. He could take calculated risks because failure wouldn't threaten his identity or self-worth. The consulting business that Marcus eventually built was a direct result of his emotional detachment. He could serve clients objectively because he wasn't emotionally invested in telling them what they wanted to hear. He could price his services appropriately because he didn't desperately need any particular client's business. He could deliver difficult truths because he wasn't afraid of losing clients who couldn't handle honesty. These qualities made him more valuable to his clients and more successful in his business than he had been as an emotionally dependent employee. Marcus also discovered that emotional detachment gave him significant advantages in leadership situations. He could make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by fear of negative consequences or desire for popularity. He could provide honest feedback to team members because he wasn't afraid of conflict or rejection. He could maintain consistent standards and expectations because his leadership style wasn't dependent on his mood or the reactions of others. The professional transformation extended to how Marcus handled success and failure. Achievements couldn't make him overconfident because his self-worth wasn't dependent on external validation. Setbacks couldn't discourage him because his identity wasn't tied to never experiencing failure. This emotional stability allowed him to maintain consistent performance regardless of external circumstances, making him a more reliable and valuable professional colleague. The creative liberation and unexpected dimension of Marcus's transformation was how emotional detachment affected his creative capabilities. Before developing this strategic indifference, Marcus had always considered himself relatively uncreative. He followed established procedures, avoided innovative approaches that might fail, and generally confined himself to safe, proven methods in both his professional and personal endeavors. The creative liberation that came with emotional detachment operated on multiple levels. First, it removed the fear of failure that had been constraining his willingness to experiment and take creative risks. When your identity and self-worth are not dependent on the success of any particular creative endeavor, you become free to try approaches that might not work, explore ideas that might be criticized, and express perspectives that might be unpopular. Marcus found himself approaching problems with fresh perspectives because he wasn't emotionally attached to conventional solutions. In his consulting work, he began proposing strategies that other consultants were afraid to suggest because they might be rejected or criticized. Some of these approaches failed, but others succeeded spectacularly precisely because they were unconventional and unexpected. The creative benefits extended beyond problem solving to actual artistic expression. Marcus had always wanted to write but had been paralyzed by fear of judgment and attachment to producing something that would be well received. Once he destroyed these emotional dependencies, he found he could write freely and honestly because he didn't need the writing to serve any purpose other than expression itself. The quality of his writing improved dramatically when it was no longer constrained by his need for approval or fear of criticism. This creative liberation also affected how Marcus approached learning and skill development. He could study subjects that interested him without needing to become expert level immediately. He could practice skills without being discouraged by initial incompetence. He could experiment with new approaches without being emotionally devastated by early failures. This freedom to learn and grow without attachment to immediate mastery accelerated his development in numerous areas. The relationship between emotional detachment and creativity revealed itself to be fundamentally about authentic expression versus image management. When you are not concerned with how your creative output will be received, you can focus entirely on expressing your authentic thoughts, perspectives, and experiences. This authenticity tends to produce more interesting and valuable creative work than efforts that are primarily designed to impress others or avoid criticism. Marcus also discovered that emotional detachment enhanced his ability to receive and incorporate feedback on his creative work. Because he wasn't emotionally attached to any particular creative choice, he could evaluate suggestions and criticism objectively. He could make changes that improved his work without feeling that these changes reflected negatively on his abilities or judgment. This openness to feedback and revision significantly improved the quality of his creative output over time. The mastery of solitude. One of the most transformative aspects of Marcus's journey was learning to not only tolerate solitude but to genuinely prefer it for extended periods. Before his transformation, being alone had been something to be endured rather than enjoyed. His sense of self-worth was so dependent on external validation that solitude felt like exile, and he had structured his life to minimize time spent alone with his thoughts. The mastery of solitude began as a practical necessity. As Marcus systematically destroyed his emotional dependencies, he found himself naturally spending more time alone. Some relationships ended because they had been built on emotional codependency rather than genuine compatibility. Some social activities lost their appeal because they had been motivated by the need for validation rather than actual enjoyment. Some professional networking became unnecessary because he was no longer seeking external sources of self-worth. Initially, this increased solitude was challenging. Marcus discovered how much of his mental activity had been devoted to processing and responding to other people's emotions, expectations, and judgments. Without these external stimuli, he was forced to confront his own thoughts, values, and desires without the distraction of social interaction. This confrontation was sometimes uncomfortable but ultimately liberating. As Marcus became more comfortable with solitude, he began to discover its strategic advantages. Alone, he could think clearly without the influence of other people's opinions or agendas. He could make decisions based purely on his own analysis rather than social pressures or expectations. He could pursue interests and activities that genuinely appealed to him rather than those that would impress others or gain approval. The mastery of solitude also provided Marcus with a kind of independence that most people never experience. Because he genuinely enjoyed his own company and didn't require social interaction for emotional stability, he could be selective about his relationships and social commitments. He could end relationships that weren't serving him, decline social invitations that didn't interest him, and generally structure his social life around quality rather than quantity. This independence from social dependency had profound implications for Marcus's decision-making across all areas of life. He could choose where to live based on his preferences rather than proximity to friends or family. He could pursue career opportunities based on their intrinsic value rather than their social prestige. He could develop interests and hobbies based on genuine curiosity rather than their social acceptability. The mastery of solitude also deepened Marcus's capacity for self-reflection and personal growth. Alone with his thoughts regularly, he could examine his motivations, evaluate his choices, and plan his future development without the distraction and influence of other people's perspectives. This self-awareness became one of his greatest strategic assets, allowing him to understand and leverage his strengths while systematically addressing his weaknesses. But, perhaps most importantly, the mastery of solitude provided Marcus with what he came to think of as emotional self-sufficiency. He could generate his own sense of well-being, entertainment, and fulfillment without requiring input from others. This self-sufficiency meant that he entered all social and professional relationships from a position of strength rather than need, fundamentally altering the dynamics of these relationships in his favor. The economics of detachment. As Marcus's transformation solidified, he began to recognize the profound economic implications of emotional detachment. The connection between emotional dependency and financial vulnerability became increasingly clear as he observed both his own financial decisions and those of people around him. Emotional attachment to outcomes, need for external validation, and fear-based decision-making consistently led to poor financial choices and missed economic opportunities. Before developing emotional detachment, Marcus's financial life had been characterized by decisions driven by fear, status concerns, and short-term emotional needs. He had chosen jobs based on security rather than growth potential, made purchases to impress others or cope with emotional stress, and avoided investment opportunities because he was afraid of losing money. His need for social approval had led him to maintain a lifestyle that was expensive but not personally fulfilling, while his fear of failure had prevented him from pursuing entrepreneurial opportunities that could have significantly improved his financial position. The economically detached Marcus approached financial decisions with entirely different criteria. He could evaluate job opportunities based purely on their potential for skill development, income growth, and strategic career advancement rather than their perceived prestige or security. He could make investment decisions based on objective analysis rather than fear of loss or hope for quick gains. He could negotiate salary and business deals from a position of genuine strength because he was prepared to walk away from any opportunity that didn't meet his standards. This transformation had immediate practical benefits. Marcus's income increased significantly as he became more strategic about career choices and more effective in negotiations. His expenses decreased as he stopped making purchases designed to impress others or cope with emotional stress. His investment returns improved as he developed the patience and objectivity necessary for long-term wealth building. The entrepreneurial possibilities that opened up through emotional detachment were particularly significant. Marcus could start businesses because he wasn't afraid of failure. If a venture didn't succeed, he would simply apply the lessons learned to the next opportunity. He could serve clients honestly because he didn't desperately need any particular client's business. He could price his services appropriately because his self-worth wasn't dependent on being liked or approved of by everyone. The consulting business that Marcus built demonstrated the economic power of emotional detachment in practice. His clients paid premium rates for his services because they knew he would provide objective advice rather than telling them what they wanted to hear. His business grew through referrals because satisfied clients trusted his judgment and integrity. His profit margins remained high because he wasn't competing on price with consultants who needed business desperately enough to undervalue their services. Marcus also discovered that emotional detachment provided significant advantages in financial markets and investment decisions. He could buy investments when others were selling out of fear and sell when others were buying out of greed. He could hold positions for appropriate time periods without being swayed by short-term market movements or emotional reactions to temporary losses. He could diversify appropriately because he wasn't attached to any particular investment or strategy. The broader economic principle that Marcus identified was that emotional dependency creates exploitable weaknesses that others can use to extract value from your financial resources. Companies spend billions of dollars studying and exploiting consumers' emotional attachments, fears, and status needs. Financial services firms profit from investors' emotional reactions to market movements. Employers maintain lower compensation packages by exploiting employees' fear of job loss and need for security. By systematically destroying these emotional vulnerabilities, Marcus had essentially made himself unexploitable from an economic perspective. He made financial decisions based on objective analysis rather than emotional manipulation, creating consistent advantages in salary negotiations, business deals, investment decisions, and consumer purchases. Over time, these advantages compounded into significant improvements in his overall financial position and security. The philosophy of invulnerability. The deepest transformation in Marcus's journey was philosophical rather than practical. As he systematically destroyed the emotional dependencies that had made him vulnerable to external influence and manipulation, he began to develop what he thought of as a philosophy of invulnerability, a comprehensive worldview built around the principle that true strength comes from having nothing that others can use against you. This philosophy went far beyond mere emotional detachment to encompass a complete restructuring of how Marcus understood power, relationships, success, and human nature itself. The foundation of this philosophy was the recognition that most human suffering comes not from external events but from our attachment to specific outcomes and our dependence on external sources of validation and security. Traditional approaches to building resilience focus on strengthening one's ability to withstand attacks or setbacks. The philosophy of invulnerability takes a different approach. It eliminates the vulnerabilities that make attacks possible in the first place. If you are not emotionally dependent on others' approval, then their disapproval cannot hurt you. If your sense of worth is not tied to external achievements, then failure cannot diminish you. If your happiness is not dependent on specific outcomes, then disappointment cannot destroy your inner peace. Marcus began to see this principle operating at every level of human experience. In relationships, the person who needs less has more power, not because they are cruel or manipulative, but because they cannot be controlled through emotional leverage. In business, the party who can walk away from a deal has enormous negotiating advantage. In creative endeavors, the artist who is not attached to specific reception of their work can create more authentically and take greater risks. The philosophy extended to how Marcus understood success and failure. Traditional definitions of success are based on external achievements and recognition, making a certain amount of money, reaching specific career milestones, gaining social approval, or achieving particular lifestyle markers. These definitions create vulnerability because they make one's sense of accomplishment dependent on factors beyond complete control. Marcus developed an alternative definition of success based entirely on factors within his control: the quality of his decisions, the consistency of his principles, the effectiveness of his actions, and the authenticity of his self-expression. This redefinition made him invulnerable to most forms of failure because his success was no longer dependent on outcomes he couldn't control. The philosophy of invulnerability also provided Marcus with a new understanding of human relationships. Instead of seeking relationships that fulfilled his emotional needs or provided validation, he began to value relationships based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine compatibility. This shift eliminated the neediness and desperation that had characterized many of his previous relationships and attracted people who appreciated his independence and authenticity. But perhaps the most profound aspect of this philosophy was how it changed Marcus's relationship to suffering itself. He began to see most emotional suffering as optional, the result of attachment to specific outcomes rather than inevitable responses to life circumstances. This perspective didn't eliminate pain from his life, but it eliminated the additional suffering that comes from resistance to pain, attachment to pain-free outcomes, and the meaning we typically assign to difficult experiences. The philosophy of invulnerability ultimately revealed itself to be a path to a kind of freedom that most people never experience: freedom from the need for external validation, freedom from attachment to specific outcomes, freedom from fear of failure or loss, and freedom from the emotional manipulation of others. This freedom created space for Marcus to live according to his own values and judgment rather than the expectations and pressures of his social environment. The strategic implementation, the transformation from emotional dependency to strategic detachment, required more than philosophical understanding. It demanded systematic implementation across every area of Marcus's life. The implementation process became a kind of life restructuring project that touched his career, relationships, daily habits, financial decisions, and even his physical environment. The career implementation began with a complete re-evaluation of Marcus's professional objectives. Instead of seeking positions that would impress others or provide security, he began targeting opportunities that would develop his skills, expand his network, and increase his strategic options. This shift led him to take calculated risks that his former self would have avoided, including leaving stable employment to start his consulting practice and pursuing clients whose projects offered learning opportunities rather than easy victories. In relationships, the implementation involved what Marcus privately called emotional auditing, systematically identifying which relationships were based on mutual value versus emotional dependency or social obligation. Some relationships naturally evolved to healthier foundations as Marcus changed his approach to interaction. Others ended because they had been built on dynamics that emotional detachment made impossible to maintain. New relationships that formed after his transformation tended to be more authentic and mutually beneficial because they weren't founded on emotional neediness. The daily habit implementation focused on creating routines that supported emotional independence rather than dependence. Marcus developed morning routines that started his day from a centered, self-sufficient state rather than immediately engaging with external stimuli like news or social media. He instituted evening reflection practices that allowed him to process the day's events objectively rather than emotionally. He created boundaries around his time and attention that preserved his mental energy for decisions and activities that aligned with his values. Financial implementation required restructuring Marcus's entire approach to money and security. He shifted from a defensive financial strategy based on fear of loss to an offensive strategy based on calculated risk-taking and value creation. This meant building emergency funds that provided genuine security rather than just psychological comfort, making investments based on long-term value rather than short-term safety, and pricing his professional services based on their actual worth rather than what he thought the market would bear without objection. The physical environment implementation involved creating spaces that supported solitude and reflection rather than social validation. Marcus redesigned his living space to be genuinely comfortable for him alone rather than impressive to visitors. He curated possessions based on their utility and personal meaning rather than their social signaling value. He chose living locations based on their alignment with his lifestyle preferences rather than their social prestige or proximity to social networks. But, the most crucial aspect of the implementation was developing what Marcus called implementation triggers, specific situations or emotional states that would automatically activate his detachment protocols. He identified the contexts where he was most likely to fall back into emotional dependency patterns and created specific responses for those situations. Over time, these responses became automatic, making his detachment sustainable rather than requiring constant conscious effort. The implementation process also required patience and self-compassion. Marcus found that transforming decades of emotional conditioning was not a linear process. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, and situations where his old patterns reasserted themselves. The key was treating these instances as data rather than failures, using them to refine his approach rather than abandoning his transformation efforts. The systematic nature of the implementation was crucial to its success. Rather than trying to change everything at once, Marcus focused on one area at a time while maintaining progress in areas he had already addressed. This approach prevented overwhelm while building momentum toward comprehensive transformation. Each successful implementation in one area provided confidence and insight that supported implementation in other areas. The compound effects. After 3 years of systematic implementation, Marcus began to recognize that emotional detachment created compound effects that were far more powerful than the sum of its individual applications. Like financial investments that grow exponentially over time, the strategic advantages of emotional detachment built upon themselves to create outcomes that were disproportionate to the effort invested. The compound effects operated across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Professional opportunities led to better networks, which led to more opportunities, which led to greater expertise, which led to higher value opportunities. Personal relationships improved in quality, which increased Marcus's capacity for genuine connection, which attracted higher quality people, which further improved his relationship experiences. Financial decisions made from detachment created better outcomes, which provided more resources for additional investments, which generated increasing returns over time. But, the most significant compound effect was in Marcus's decision-making capability itself. Each decision made from emotional detachment rather than fear or attachment provided data about effective decision-making strategies. This data improved future decision-making, which led to better outcomes, which provided more confidence in the detachment approach, which made it easier to maintain detachment in challenging situations. Marcus observed similar compound effects in his creativity and problem-solving abilities. As he became more comfortable with failure and criticism, he was willing to try more innovative approaches. Some of these approaches failed, but others succeeded spectacularly, building his reputation for creative thinking and opening doors to projects that required innovative solutions. The success of these projects increased his confidence in creative risk-taking, creating an upward spiral of creative development. The compound effects were particularly evident in Marcus's consulting business. Early clients hired him because of his specific expertise, but they renewed his contracts and referred him to others because of his emotional detachment and objectivity. These qualities became his primary competitive advantage, allowing him to command premium rates and attract higher-level clients who valued straight-talking advisors. As his client base improved, so did his expertise and network, creating ever-increasing value for subsequent clients. The social compound effects were perhaps the most surprising to Marcus. As he became genuinely indifferent to social approval, he became more attractive to others, not because he was trying to be attractive, but because authentic self-confidence is inherently appealing. This attractiveness led to better social opportunities, which exposed him to higher quality people, which further improved his social experiences and reinforced his preference for authenticity over approval seeking. Marcus also recognized compound effects in his personal development and learning. Because he was no longer afraid of appearing incompetent during the learning process, he was willing to study subjects and develop skills outside his areas of expertise. This intellectual curiosity led to insights that enhanced his professional work, which provided resources for further learning, which created an expanding cycle of personal growth and capability development. The philosophical compound effects were the most profound. As Marcus experienced the practical benefits of emotional detachment across multiple areas of his life, his confidence in the underlying philosophy increased. This confidence made it easier to apply the philosophy in new situations and contexts, which provided additional evidence of its effectiveness, which deepened his commitment to the approach. But perhaps the most important compound effect was the elimination of what Marcus came to think of as energy drain. Before his transformation, significant mental and emotional energy was constantly being directed toward managing other people's opinions, avoiding potential failures, and maintaining his self-image. As he eliminated these energy drains, that mental and emotional capacity became available for more productive purposes: creative thinking, strategic planning, skill development, and genuine relationship building. The compound nature of these effects meant that the benefits of emotional detachment continued to grow long after the initial implementation effort. What began as a defensive strategy for protecting himself from emotional manipulation had evolved into a comprehensive approach to living that created advantages in every area of his life. The integration and mastery. 5 years after that pivotal moment in Janet Williams's conference room, Marcus had achieved something that few people ever experience: complete integration of emotional detachment as a natural way of being rather than a conscious strategy requiring effort. The transformation had become so thorough that his original emotionally dependent self seemed like a different person, someone he could remember but no longer understood or identified with. The integration process had been gradual and almost imperceptible. Where he once had to consciously remember to apply detachment protocols in challenging situations, emotional non-reactivity had become his default response. Where he once had to deliberately redirect his attention from external validation to internal standards, self-sufficiency had become automatic. Where he once had to force himself to remain centered during conflict or criticism, equanimity had become his natural state. This integration created a kind of personal mastery that affected every interaction and decision. Marcus could sit in meetings where others became defensive or reactive and serve as a stabilizing influence without effort or intention. He could receive both praise and criticism with equal composure, extracting useful information from both while being influenced emotionally by neither. He could face uncertainty and change without the anxiety that characterized most people's responses to unstable situations. The mastery extended beyond personal emotional management to include an almost intuitive understanding of others' emotional patterns and vulnerabilities. Because he had systematically studied and eliminated his own emotional dependencies, Marcus could recognize similar patterns in others with remarkable accuracy. This recognition wasn't used for manipulation. His detachment eliminated the need to control or influence others, but it provided him with strategic advantages in negotiations, relationships, and conflict resolution. The business applications of this integrated mastery were profound. Marcus could assess potential clients' real needs versus their stated wants because he could see past their emotional attachments to particular solutions. He could provide advice that served his clients' actual interests rather than their preferences, building long-term trust even when his recommendations were initially unwelcome. He could navigate complex organizational politics without becoming entangled in them, maintaining his effectiveness while others became distracted by interpersonal dramas. But the most significant aspect of the integration was how it had transformed Marcus's experience of life itself. The constant background anxiety that had characterized his previous existence, the worry about others' opinions, the fear of failure, the attachment to specific outcomes had been replaced by a kind of inner stillness that remained constant regardless of external circumstances. This stillness wasn't emptiness or indifference, it was a deep sense of centeredness that provided a stable foundation for all of his activities and relationships. The mastery also included what Marcus thought of as strategic flexibility, the ability to adapt his approach to any situation based on what would be most effective rather than what felt most comfortable or familiar. He could be social when social interaction served his purposes, solitary when solitude was more beneficial, aggressive when assertiveness was called for, or gentle when compassion was needed. This flexibility was possible because none of these approaches threatened his sense of identity or triggered emotional reactions. The integration had also transformed Marcus's relationship to time and planning. Because he was no longer emotionally attached to specific outcomes, he could make long-term plans without being distressed by uncertainty about results. He could invest time and effort in projects that might not pay off for years because his satisfaction came from the quality of his work rather than immediate rewards. He could also abandon plans that were no longer serving him without feeling like he had wasted his previous efforts. Perhaps most importantly, the integration had created what Marcus recognized as genuine freedom, not the absence of constraints, but the presence of choice in every moment. He could choose his responses to any situation based on wisdom rather than conditioning, values rather than fears, and strategic thinking rather than emotional reactivity. This freedom had become so natural that he sometimes forgot how rare it was until he observed others struggling with emotional patterns that he had long since transcended. The man who had once sat in that conference room, devastated by the loss of a job he had never particularly enjoyed, had been completely reconstructed into someone who could not be destroyed by others because there was nothing left in him that external forces could use as leverage. He had achieved the ultimate strategic advantage, invulnerability through the systematic destruction of weakness rather than the building of defenses. Epilogue: the quiet advantage that Marcus had discovered was not visible to casual observation. He didn't appear dramatically different from other successful professionals, he wasn't more charismatic, more aggressive, or more obviously confident than his peers. The advantage was subtle but decisive. While others made decisions based on emotions they couldn't control, he made decisions based on principles he had chosen. While others were vulnerable to manipulation through their emotional dependencies, he could not be controlled by anyone because he needed nothing from anyone that he couldn't provide for himself. This advantage compounded daily in ways that were almost imperceptible individually but transformative collectively. Every negotiation where he could walk away gave him better terms. Every relationship where he needed nothing gave him more influence. Every decision made without fear of failure led to better outcomes. Every interaction where he remained centered while others became reactive increased his relative position. The quiet advantage was that Marcus had become, in the most practical sense, indestructible. Not physically, he remained as vulnerable to accidents and illness as anyone else, but psychologically and strategically. There was nothing that others could do to him emotionally because he had systematically eliminated all the emotional leverage points that they could use against him. But, perhaps the greatest advantage was the peace that came with this invulnerability. Marcus had discovered that most of human suffering is optional, the result of attachment to outcomes beyond our control rather than inevitable responses to life circumstances. By destroying these attachments systematically and completely, he had not eliminated challenge, difficulty, or loss from his life, but he had eliminated the additional suffering that most people create for themselves through their emotional responses to these inevitable experiences. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because there is nothing left in him that can be destroyed. This is not a metaphor or philosophical concept, it is a practical reality that can be achieved through systematic effort and strategic thinking. Marcus had proven this to himself beyond any doubt, and, in doing so, had discovered a form of personal power that was both profound and completely sustainable. In the end, the quiet advantage was simply this: while others spent their lives trying to get what they wanted, Marcus had learned to want nothing that he couldn't provide for himself. This wantlessness had given him everything he had ever truly desired, along with many things he had never known to desire. He had achieved the ultimate paradox of human ambition: